Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode 7 of Inside the Club. This week, we have another special guest, a fan favorite for people who have followed the Utah Hockey Club and previously the Arizona Coyotes. We are joined by Craig Morgan, who covered the Coyotes for 20 years, and now he's doing weekly content for the Utah Hockey Club. So someone who obviously knows the organization very well, past, present, and future. So Craig, thank you so much for joining us this week. How are you doing?
I am, as I mentioned to you off air, still swimming upstream trying to learn my new job, but I don't want to bore people with details of the legal field. I got to ask how you're doing. How are you enjoying Four Nations, Belle?
It's been great. Yeah, so when we're recording this, it's the night before the USA-Canada final. For people listening, when this comes out, we'll know who won. But yeah, I've been in Boston this week covering it, and it was really cool. We were talking, seeing Olli Maatta be such a big part of Team Finland's defense. You know, I think he always was going to have a role, but then they lose 3 of their main guys, and he's kind of the gap filler like he is in Utah. So he kind of took on the same role, and then Juuso Välimäki was a healthy scratch for both games, but saw him practice, so it was cool seeing that. But yeah, now I have a little bit of an excuse to watch the US-Canada game, which will be fun, and have been talking to some Utah fans this week about how they've received the Four Nations, just seeing the NHL's best on best. So I'll have a story on that. But yeah, it's been good. I'm excited to get back to regular season, though. It feels like they've been off for a while.
Yeah, I know the players have probably enjoyed this break.
I'm
The
sure.
fans not so much, but it's go time now, right? 26 games left in the season, and they stayed in the hunt. They really did stay in the hunt. So
Hmm.
it's going to be really interesting, especially with that back-to-back that they come out of the break with. It's crazy. Those two games, those two teams they're chasing, so they're both very important games.
Yeah, the schedule makers did it right. It's almost like they knew how close the the race was going to be because, I mean, I was listening to a lot of the interviews today, and the players are saying the next 5 games will kind of make or break our season, which is true. So that'll be very interesting to see. Before we get into second half push and kind of what Utah needs to do to get inside a wild card spot, wanted to go back to Four Nations because the NHL has kind of been put on the biggest stage it has been in a while. The records for the amount of people watching the Four Nations games, the USA Canada one on Saturday, I think was the most of any non-Stanley Cup game since 2014, 10 years. So that's pretty crazy. Just Craig, as someone who's covered the league and maybe its lack of popularity or growing popularity, what do you think this tournament has kind of done to spread the game, make new fans, things of that sort?
I think it's just reminded people how great international competition can be when you bring it back. And you mentioned the ratings. I was really encouraged. I knew Sweden would be watching. I knew Finland would be watching. I knew Canada would be watching, but I wasn't sure if the US was going to be watching. And the US is watching. Those were good numbers. So it was really encouraging to see that. I love international hockey. I love these sorts of tournaments. Honestly, I wish it were expanded a little more. I understand why it's not. That's coming down the road. We'll have more teams involved, but it's really cool because it's been way too long. It's been 9 years
Yep.
since we've had any kind of true best on best. I know they have the World Championships, but you know how that is. It's during the playoffs for the NHL, so a lot of players don't go, and even if they're done, they're hurt or they're tired, so you just don't get the best rosters for the World Championship. This is really cool to see best on best, and I'm really happy to hear that the World Cup of Hockey and the Olympics
Yep.
are part of the regular plan going forward.
Yeah, that's really exciting to hear. And for newer hockey fans, NHL players haven't been in best on best tournament since the 2014 Olympic Games. Obviously, I was going to touch on this too, if the midseason injuries are an issue with these tournaments, but because of that, the NHL wasn't allowing their players to participate in these games just because it's right before the playoff push, as we're talking about, and you don't want your stars going and getting hurt midseason. But they're allowed to go back and play, and hopefully that remains the same when the Olympics are brought to Salt Lake City in 2034 as well. But this is kind of a primer for the Olympics, Craig. These teams, the players that made the rosters and the players that didn't, namely Clayton Keller, who felt like he could have helped that U.S. team. Just how much do you think this helps people get excited for the Olympics with the NHL's return?
Oh, I absolutely think it whets people's appetite, and I think the league is hoping the same, right? Because
Hmm.
they're touting the World Cup of Hockey, they're touting the Olympics. This definitely reminds people how good it can be. I mean, I'm old enough to remember the Miracle on Ice,
Hmm.
but I've always watched the Olympics. I will always watch Olympic hockey. Now that we'll have the World Cup of Hockey as well. It's funny, people don't even remember like the 2016 tournament, right? Because they held it what, August and September. And
Mhm.
when I talked to Bill Daly for a story that I wrote recently, he's like, we're not doing that anymore. It's almost like it's an afterthought when it gets done at that time of year. The challenge, of course, is okay, how do you convince European leagues that they should allow their players to play midseason, which is, of course, ironically, what they're asking for the
And
Olympics.
yeah.
So there's got to be a little bit of give and take. It's going to be interesting to hear what those conversations produce. I know the NHL is very hopeful that there will be give and take here. I think the PA is kind of in lockstep with the league. So hopefully they'll get this all ironed out. But I think one way or another, even if they have to host it on North American soil, the World Cup of Hockey's coming, the Olympics are coming. They're going to be NHL players in those tournaments again, and that's good for all hockey fans.
It is. And I was listening to Spit and Chicklets, of course, this week, and Jeff Merrick was on, and they're kind of talking about the future of four nations with the World Cup coming and obviously the Olympics. And he was saying he thinks it's going to be a one and done, that it was a great tournament now, but it's not going to kind of be a tradition. It seems to be much better option than the All-Star game, the All-Star events that no one wants to watch. How do you see this continuing, not continuing, just how they use this gap in the schedule if it's not the World Cup or if it's not the Winter Olympics?
Bill Daly did tell me the same thing, that this is going to be a one-off. They
Hmm.
have no intention of bringing this tournament back. So in a way, it's kind of cool if you got to participate in. You could say, "Hey, I was there for that one-off tournament, and it was a cool tournament." But I don't think they even want to have something filling that gap every year. I think they'd
Hmm.
still like to do the All-Star game. It is still a marketing tool, if nothing else, for the NHL. So I think they'll have that. But this allows them to bring the international competition back every other year. So it's a nice balance, I think, a nice mix of events.
And players seem to really care too. I remember when it was announced, some people were like, these guys they're not going to take it seriously, or fans aren't going to take it seriously. And it's been the exact opposite. We've seen a lot of pride in it. And we mentioned Clayton Keller, but also Matthias Michelli was left off of Finland. He's kind of been struggling this season, but it seems like a lot of these players could use it as extra motivation to make those Olympic rosters. Craig, is there anyone on the Utah Hockey Club roster that didn't make, either of these four teams or any other teams left out that you kind of have your eye on for making a push for the Olympic rosters?
Well, Clayton's the guy without a doubt. I
Hmm.
honestly, I thought Clayton should have been on the roster this year. And I know that he was a little miffed about it, and you've seen how he's been producing. So maybe it was motivation for him. I don't know if players need that sort of motivation. I don't want to put that out there that, oh,
Hmm.
this is the reason he's on a tear right now. But I know he cared about not making it, and I know he wants to make the Olympic roster. And he's the guy that I would point to more than anyone. Hey, if Matthias can get himself back on track too, maybe he's on that roster for Finland as well.
When you look at guys like Logan Cooley and Dylan Gunther, they're the biggest names in Utah, but because it's a smaller market, they're not on Sports Center every night and kind of getting their production blasted around the league. Do you think they have a sniff at kind of any consideration for these teams with how they're playing this year and kind of carrying the group as 20 and 21-year-olds?
Well, let's see what they do in the coming time between now and the Olympics. Logan Cooley, I mean, he's done everything they've asked of him this season, right?
Hmm.
He's taken a huge step forward in his development. His 200-foot game is so much better than when he came in the league. So yeah, he has a chance that and I think maybe has a better chance than Dylan Gunther simply because he's trying to crack
Canada.
the U.S. roster versus
Yeah.
the Canadian roster. But I say that, and then I watch Dylan Gunther, and every time he has, I was just talking to Andre about this, Andre Tourigny, the coach. He said he thinks he's even better than before he got injured, which is crazy. But
Yep.
I remember talking to Dylan Gunther a long time ago, and after it, I wrote a story saying, people look at all his other attributes. His best attribute may be his attitude, because every time he experiences what other people think may be a slight or a demotion, you hear it in his voice that he's not happy about it. And I remember
Yeah.
that first talk when he got sent back to the WHL. I was thinking, uh-oh, is this going to be a problem? It was the opposite. He used it as fuel. He always does that, and he always seems to come out better on the other end. This kid's attitude is unbelievable. He has one of the most elite shots in the NHL. So, yeah, Dylan Gunther has a chance of making that roster.
Yeah, and going to what you're saying about him being better after the injury, I talked to him on the latest road trip, and he was saying that not that he forgets, but it is his first full NHL season. You know, he came in halfway through the season last year, so he said to him, a production slump is not a real slump in the NHL. He goes a couple games without getting a point, but he said mentally and physically, like he felt the taxing wear of being a full-time NHLer. And he said he really wanted to take his injury time to not just heal physically, but mentally too, get away from the game for a second. He said he's now really excited to show up at the rink. Not that he wasn't before, but he said it's nice to kind of be away from it. So you go in with a little extra juice. And he said he also used the time to put on extra weight that he had been losing throughout the
Yeah.
season. Because you think about he's playing double the games, double the ice time, really important roles. So I think that was really interesting too, where of course no one wants to be injured, but he kind of took advantage of it and used it as a way to make himself get better. And I think that talks to the maturity and kind of the mindset that you pointed to. So that's going to be an exciting guy to watch and a really big part of Utah's second half push or third quarter push, we should call it now, with 26 games. And Craig, you talked to Coach and Bill Armstrong recently just about where their heads are at going into this final push of their inaugural season. What were the main takeaways that you got? We can start with Coach about where he thinks the team is and kind of what he's looking for in this stretch.
Well, both of them noted the significant injuries. Bill had told me that he was seeing a bunch of comparisons to where they were last year. And of course, they're 7 points clear where they were last year. And yet they've had just significant injuries. We've talked about how the blue line's just been decimated
Yep.
all season, and they've had key forwards out of the lineup for significant periods of time as well. And yet they're better in the standings. I know that's the superficial measure of whether this team is making progress. If you talk to Andre, he'll look at all the underlying stats, and he said it. When you looked last year, it was like we were in the red everywhere.
Hmm.
Even if we're winning games, we're in the red. That's not the case anymore. We're challenging to be in the top 15 or top 10 in the league in a lot of categories. So they're seeing progress. The young players, as we just discussed, guys like Cooley and Gunther, even Josh Stone coming back, Michael Kesselring, you can Jack McBain, you can name a lot of guys. They've made strides, and that's really important because that's the future of this club. That's what they've been planning for all along with those guys as the core. They've all taken steps forward, but the injuries have played such a role that I think everybody's just excited to see what this team might look like. Knock on wood, if it stays healthy. You got
Hmm.
a chance to have everybody back in the lineup very soon, and really, to Bill's point, you get a chance to evaluate what you have. There are 6 games left before the trade deadline. You kind of want to know what your team is capable of before you start making decisions on whether you're a seller or a buyer.
Hmm. I think that's what makes the trade deadline very interesting at this point too, because Bill has repeatedly said that it's going to be the team and the players that decide if this team is buyer or seller. It'll determine if he feels comfortable selling off pieces or not. But it's getting down to the wire, and I mean, I haven't watched that much hockey. I mean, I have, but I'm in my 20s, so this is a small sample size. But it feels like in the past you really could see the playoff picture by Christmas, New Year. You know, teams were missing the playoffs by 20 points when I was growing up. I remember like Islanders, Rangers, we were like by November we were packing it up. But now, you know, the entire West and even the East, it's so close, and it could be as close at this trade deadline, and you could sell or buy and then not make the playoffs or randomly make the playoffs. So do you feel that that kind of complicates the picture for Utah, that they're getting healthy now? They're 4 or 5 points out now, and they only have this short time frame of 2 to 3 weeks for Bill to kind of make this decision.
Yeah, it's not an easy situation, but I think Bill would tell you he's still happy that he has the opportunity, assuming they don't suffer any more injuries, right? Let's hope that they don't have to deal with that anymore because they've certainly had more than their share. But it is what it is. GMs deal with this all the time. You sometimes you are close to the picture and you have to do an honest evaluation of where you are as a team in your development and your preparedness to not only make the playoffs but actually do something when you get there. I think they have a lot of that information right now. I think
Hmm.
they're going to get a bunch more by watching this team play healthy. But again, I guess I would say it's always been about the future with Bill Armstrong. And Andre said this in the story as well. Bill did too, to an extent. If they're in the playoff push, but they don't make it, they're still going to consider this season a success, provided
Right.
they play well down the stretch and stay in it. So I don't know that this is going to be like, oh, okay, let's just be big buyers at the trade deadline. That
Hmm.
doesn't really make a lot of sense based on what Bill has said about the trajectory of this team. It doesn't seem like they're going to be adding all these big pieces at the trade deadline. Of course, I say that and he'll do the dead opposite and I'll be completely wrong.
Well, it'll
But
be interesting for everyone either way.
yeah, but based on, what he has said in the past, it doesn't seem like that. Maybe you add a piece or two to try and get into the playoffs, but it's not going to be wholesale. And if it's the flip side where they, like if the player said, if it's 5 games and they fall off the pace, then you start looking at the guys on expiring contracts and think, okay, what's their value? Are you getting enough value to make that make sense? And I don't know if you wanted to talk about that, but we could go there
I
as well.
I
Is that
was literally about to bring that up.
okay?
When we talk about not making crazy moves, but also using the trade deadline, I wrote about this in my mailbag, but it could be a time to get value back for veteran players who are going to be unrestricted free agents this summer, who contending teams could really use as depth pieces. I think Nick Bukestad, Alex Kerfoot, Ian Cole, Ole Mata, those are players that one have extreme winning experience when you look at the defensemen they have on Utah's roster that they could trade, but also I wouldn't want to get rid of Alex Kerfoot, but that is a guy that could do power play, penalty kill.
Mhm.
He's the only player on Utah's roster that has played on first, second, third, and fourth lines this season. His versatility and just his veteran leadership, I think any team would want for a playoff push. And we're not in Bill Armstrong's head, we're not in Alex Kerfoot's head, but if you know you don't want to re-sign, if they know they're not going to want to extend him or Nick Bukestad or any of the unrestricted free agents, Karel Vejmelka even, do
Mm.
you use this trade deadline to get player for player, picks, prospects, whatever it is, just get some value for these pieces instead of losing the negotiation in the offseason?
Yeah, it's so much of it's going to depend on the market too, which I don't think GMs have a sense of yet. So we're going to have to see how the market gets set. First of all, what sort of value those players, those 4 players you talked about, plus Karel Vejmelka, who's the wild card in my opinion.
Yeah.
You normally don't get a lot of value for goalies at the trade deadline. Maybe this would be different if there's a team that believes it needs a piece like that, but maybe they also want to re-sign him. Like you mentioned, Ole Mata, like where's this team without him this season? Where
No,
are
it's nowhere.
yeah. So do you think I kind of want him back? Do you start thinking about bringing Ole Mata back instead of getting value for him? Do you do what they did with Nick Bukestad a couple of years ago? You trade him and then
Then
re-sign
get
him
it back.
in the offseason. A lot of those possibilities exist, but yeah, those are the key names. The guys that you mentioned, those are the guys I look at. One other name that I'd throw in, I'm still not sure that they're ready with this one, but I do wonder about Nick Schmaltz long term with this
Mhm.
franchise. If they'll look to make that move, or if they'll wait till next season when he is on an expiring contract. Who knows?
Mhm.
Maybe they'll re-sign Nick Schmaltz. Again, I could be completely wrong, but when you look at the trajectory and the ages of this team, right? That's a guy that maybe doesn't fit in the plans down the road when this team hopes to be a contender.
Craig, you're reading my mind. I had that on the list. I wanted to add in Lawson Krause with that group too. When you just look at, I mean, Utah has a lot of money to spend. Bill has been very smart with the salary cap. But when you look at the top three highest paid forwards, it's Clayton Keller, who is locked into a Utah jersey. My best guess for as long as he wants to be. But then Nick Schmaltz and Lawson Krause are top dollar guys who, like you said, when you have guys like Cooley and Gunther and Doan and Tisha Ginla coming up, obviously different positions, but when you look at the depth of the forward group and the cost that they're paying these guys, and Lawson Krause has had a down year, if they moved on, when do you see them doing that and handling that? Because obviously both of those guys were A's. They've been a big part of this leadership group, a big part of the transition from Arizona to Utah, so it could have effects in the locker room. But just if I grouped Kraus in there with it, do you see them as, in 2, 3 years still a part of that core?
It's really hard to predict. I hate doing those sorts of predictions. I would hesitate to say that Lawson Krause is going anywhere right now. I know that maybe Utah fans have a different view of him than the long view of Lawson Krause, but I've
Hmm.
seen him play for a very long period of time. I know what he brings to that room. I know what he can bring to the team. He's also, as Andre mentioned, adapting to a completely different role where he's playing less minutes in different situations, and it takes some time. I think that they'll probably see if they can get the Lawson Krause and they know back to
Hmm.
a certain level of play. But Nick Schmaltz, again, if it's not at this trade deadline, and there's an argument to be made not to do it this year, I would look at next year's trade deadline and think about him as a strong possibility on an expiring contract.
Yeah, and I also think Schmaltz is a guy that you know what you have in him and you know what you're getting out of him. It feels like where Krause's ceiling is higher than he's playing right now, you know what you're getting from Nick Schmaltz, where you might feel more comfortable trading him than a player like Matthias Michelli, who maybe the production hasn't been there, but that potential you're tied to, and you've seen what you want from him, and you feel like that ceiling's there too. So it is interesting. I would not want to be a GM because there's 1,000 different ways you could go.
That's the rule,
Um,
right? Don't trade a guy
yeah,
when the asset is devalued. Don't trade then. You
yeah,
trade him
because you
when
know they're going to go to the team you trade them to and score 30-goal season and make a playoff push. So,
yeah.
yeah, these are, hypotheticals, but it's fun talking about it on our end, obviously. Um, to look at what the team does have and maybe some more positives going into this, the defense. Shawn Durzi is back after playing just 4 games to start the season, and this is going to be the first time all year that John Marino, Mikhail Sergachev, and Shawn Durzi are all in the lineup at the same time, which is crazy because all the preseason articles we were kind of talking about how Bill Armstrong is the architect for this blue line that will feature these 3 players, and there will be supporting pieces, and these guys have played but kind of one at a time, two at a time. So what do you think this does for the team, obviously for the decor, but just the entire roster to have a top 2 pairs that are a literal top 2 pairs? No disrespect to the guys who've been filling in, but those are guys that you would have on a playoff team in your top 2 defensive pairings.
Yeah, it filters throughout the entire roster, right? Coaches always talk about guys slotting into their proper roles, and you need it at the forward groups too. Like you need
Hmm.
Logan Cooley back, you need pieces in the right places. You don't want guys playing above their level. I'm not saying that guys can't eventually get to that level, but you want people playing in spots where they belong right now. This is going to allow them to do that on the back end, and like you said, we're going to get a chance to see this highly touted blue line play
Hmm.
together for the first time this season. I'm curious what it does because they could be a very good blue line with all of these pieces in place. I think Mikhail Sergachev has pretty much answered every question they had about him. I know it took a little time to adjust, but he's eating heavy minutes, really tough situations. He's producing. He's really good. And the Marino pairing, at least for now, we'll see what happens when Simashev comes over in the long run.
Right.
But uh, there's a lot of potential in this blue line, and since I mentioned Dmitry Simashev, a lot more coming too. They have really good problems on their back end when you consider the blue line pieces that they have on the NHL roster and then the depth that they have in their organization. This is a position of strength for this organization.
And that's been a big topic of conversation, especially for Andre, where he's like, this is one of the first times in the past couple of years that I've had to make hard decisions before the game, that I have to leave everyday NHL players out of the lineup. And he talks about that with Michael Carconi, with Liam O'Brien. Even when Matthias Michelli and Lawson Krause were healthy scratches, he said, you feel bad for the individual, but that shows that we are where we need to be as an organization, that players as talented, as important as those guys are on the outside looking in, and especially on the back end as well. Kolechanik went on waivers and got claimed. That was a guy that was in the lineup earlier this year. Juuso Välimäki has been a healthy scratch because Nick DeSimone has kind of taken that job. But the internal competition this team is dealing with is a good thing. I know fans like to see their favorite players play and everything, but a team progressing, a team that has what it takes to move forward in the future, leaves guys out of the lineup. And like you said, good problem to have, and good problem that Shawn Durzi will add one more body to the blue line. Utah fans, he's a big name, but he only played 4 games, so they didn't really see a lot of him. Craig, what can you say about Shawn Durzi, his time in Arizona, and kind of what he meant to that group, and then signs his extension this summer, so management obviously believes in him. But, maybe just an overview, player and person that Utah hockey fans are going to get to see as the season ends.
Well, I think a lot of people will just sort of think of him as an offensive defenseman, and he has very good offensive skills. He can move a puck. He can run a power play, although, he may have to run the second power play. Maybe they'll go with 2 defensemen. I don't think so. I don't think
Hmm.
they'll run both he and Sergachev out there, but he can certainly run a power play. He can do a lot for your offense. He can ignite offense. He has speed through the neutral zone. He can carry the puck through the neutral zone. The area of the game that they asked Shawn Durzi to work on, and I think he has, is his defensive game, his 200-foot game, being better in his own zone and closing out guys. I think he's worked on that. Obviously, this injury was a setback, so you don't get to get those reps and see that progress. It'll be interesting to see what he can do in the entire, in his entire 200-foot game when he comes
Mhm.
back. But certainly the offensive side, after a little bit of adjustment, getting up to game speed, that's what's going to pop for Utah fans.
And Coach was talking about today just his leadership in the room and the personality. I was talking to John Marino and he was saying just a different energy when Shawn Durzi is in the locker room. Do you believe that? Kind of what's your take on that? What he brings just to, the morale of the team.
When he came over from LA, when I was covering him here, I got a couple LA writers reached out to me like, "Oh my God, you're going to love Shawn Durzi. He's the best interview." And they were right. So I say that to you now. Enjoy Shawn Durzi. He'll be a great quote, post-game quote, whatever you need. He will be available and he will be incredible for you. But yeah, he brings a good energy, a good vibe to the room. I agree with that completely.
Yeah, we were joking because even through training camp and preseason, he was an easy quote if you needed, something for a story. And he got hurt. And we're like, we feel bad for him, but we feel worse for our for our stories. We're losing a great source
No,
here.
we
So
can't give that away. We can't tell people that it's all about us.
yeah, sorry guys. We don't care about the injuries. We just need a good headline. Kidding, kidding. Okay, so to close it out, we mentioned maybe just a couple superlatives for the team. Craig, you know these players extremely well. So, from your perspective, and you've watched them develop, most impactful players so far this season.
Ooh, that's hard. I'd almost have to go by position groups because
You could do that.
Clayton Keller's I think he's still on pace for a career year in points this year.
Yep.
So, he's really stepped it up. I think Mikhail Sergachev has been what they hoped he would be. So he's the guy on the blue line eating massive minutes. And then credit to Karel Vejmelka, who has come back from people assumed here last season that Connor Ingram had just passed him for good. And Karel Vejmelka's having a terrific season. So like I would cite all three of those guys and I'm still leaving guys out like Dylan Gunther, who we mentioned
Mhm.
earlier, who I can't get him to talk about what his goal scoring goals are. He doesn't even think about him, but I think this guy could be a 40 goal scorer in the NHL. He's that pure a goal scorer, probably the purest goal scorer I covered since Keith Kachuk, which is crazy to say.
Wow, that is high praise. It is funny. It feels like Gunther, part of the reason he's so good is because he doesn't really think about it. Like he'll score 2 game winners in a run. He's like, yeah, like I was just open and I was just feeling the puck. And it's like, it really help. It must help. He doesn't overthink anything. His goal is to just shoot and get the puck off his stick. And I think that mindset, the simplicity in it, has really worked for him. Because
Yeah.
so many guys say how mental the game is, and Gunther has seemed to simplify it to puck in net, score, and he's good to go. Most improved player. You can do this by position too if you want, but
Most improved player. Bell's putting me on the spot here. I mean, one of the guys that we talked about earlier, I have to acknowledge how much better his 200-foot game has gotten. The Logan Cooley. They
mhm.
wanted to see him. One of the biggest questions I thought for Utah going into this season was how big a step can Logan Cooley take? And I think he's taken a really big step. I think he's been a massive part. As Bill said the other day, you really want your young guys to be driving it when they're out on
Mhm.
the ice, and that's been the case this season. So I guess without thinking about it nearly enough, I will say Logan Cooley. I
Mhm.
might think about someone later and be, I should have mentioned that person instead.
Cooley's a good one to do. I was going to ask you separately as a tag on to this question about Josh Doan. I feel like he hasn't had a big enough sample size to label him as most improved, but he did come in after Gunther's injury, and then Gunther came back, and Doan kept his lineup spot. They didn't just send him back down after he was done filling in as the 12th forward. And he seems like he had the same mindset as Gunther last year, where is if I get called up, I'm going to stay. And he was sent back down during the Four Nations break just to get reps, called back up. But what do you see for him and what he's done this season and, what he can do in the future?
I see him as a full-time NHL player without a doubt. And I had questions about that a few years ago during his development. There were a lot of people who wondered when they took him with a second round pick if he was going to pan out. But there are those genes. He does
Hmm.
have those genes. He has really good mentors. He's had them all his life. He's grown up around locker rooms. He knows so many NHL players. He understands how it works. And he's got his dad in his ear, but at the same time, keeping a distance. He's also got an incredible mother, by the way. I don't want to shortchange Andrea at all. He's got an incredible attitude, different from Dylan Gunther, but he's a blender too. He gets along with everyone. He's a guy that's definitely a glue guy in the room. Everybody likes him, and you saw that with Shane. But aside from that, he is diligent in his work. And Andre, I'm sure, has told you this a million times. He understands the game. He has very high hockey IQ. He understands what to do in situations. And I think it's just going to keep developing. I don't know if he's going to go back down. Maybe he'll have to at some point because of their contract situations, but
yeah,
he's pushing really hard to stick around.
Yeah, that's really the only reason I could see him going back down. For newer fans, Josh is still second year in the league, not a full year, and entry level. So when he gets sent down to the AHL, he doesn't have to clear waivers. He can just go straight to Tucson without other teams having 24-hour period to pick him up. So when you're looking at who to send down, if you sent down Liam O'Brien or Michael Carconi or any of the extra forwards, you have the chance of losing them. So sometimes it's just easier to send Doan or a younger guy down because you get to keep them in the organization. Doesn't mean he necessarily deserves to be sent down, but that's just how it works sometimes.
Tucson would love to have him. Steve Popham would love to have him because they're different when he's in their lineup.
Yeah. It was funny. I don't know if you saw this, Craig. At the Capitals game before the break, the printed out line sheet said Shane Doan on it instead of Josh. I was like, that was funny
because we always call Shane, we call him Josh's father now.
That's funny.
He doesn't like it, but you know.
Well, new era in the organization, right. I guess. Lastly, unsung hero for Utah Hockey Club this season?
Two guys again. Sorry, this is
taking
the easy way out, but you mentioned Alex Kerfoot and Mr. Versatility. Like if you go back through every club that he's ever played for, he's had that same role. He can play up and down the lineup. He's effective all over the ice. I think he's one guy that you have to look at, but the other guy that we mentioned, and I don't know if he's unsung at this point, but I hope people understand how much Olli Mata has meant to this team. I have no idea where this team would be without him. He's been so solid for them, playing much bigger minutes than I think anybody expected him to play.
It's like a career high for him through
easy, right?
12 years, 15 years, career high this season.
Yeah. They are in love with what he has brought to this team. So he would be the other guy that I would mention.
A guy, like you said, that maybe has played his way into a contract extension if he wants one. So that'll be interesting to see. Craig, thank you so much for joining this week. I'm sure all the fans are very excited to hear your brilliant insight again. For people wanting to read your content on Utah Hockey Club, where can they find you, and social media as well?
Yeah, at Craig S. Morgan is my Twitter handle. I'm on Blue Sky. You can find me there as well. But yeah, I would say just go to the Utah Hockey Club website. You'll see all sorts of content from me. I think I'm writing 4 pieces of content per week. So a couple game recaps, a look at the week ahead, and then a feature every week.
Perfect. Everyone check that out. And thank you everyone for listening this week. We will talk to you next week.